The vast interior of 18th century North America was a world of green walls and silent rivers, a landscape that swallowed armies and humbled empires. Thick hardwood forests stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by winding streams and the smoke of distant villages. In that environment, battles were not fought on open fields or in neat lines, but in shadows, under canopies, along deer trails and narrow ridges. For generations, native nations had made this wilderness their home and their battlefield. Their way of war was shaped by the land itself. Swift ambushes from the undergrowth, sudden raids that vanished into the trees, and close-quarters combat, where courage and skill with blade or bow decided life and death within a few paces. Warriors from nations like the Shawnee, Delaware and Cherokee did not fight for abstract notions of conquest or empire. War was often a deeply personal duty, a matter of honor, retribution, and defense of their people's hunting grounds and sacred places. Small war parties would travel silently for days, each man carrying his own supplies and weapons, often moving without leaving a single track. They favored ambush over siege, speed over brute force. A warrior who struck without being seen, who returned without losing a man, was respected as much as one who stood his ground in battle. These were not undisciplined bands, but highly skilled fighters with centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to move, fight, and survive in terrain that defeated conventional European armies. Into this world came settlers, soldiers and merchants from across the Atlantic, driven by promises of land, trade, and empire. By the early 1700s, the French and British had carved out rival claims stretching from the Great Lakes to the Appalachian Mountains, and they saw the vast lands beyond as the prize that would decide the future of North America. For them, the frontier was both a resource and a battlefield, one that demanded alliances with native nations and forced them to adapt their European tactics. Soldiers drilled to fight in open formations found themselves scattered in the trees, trading volleys with enemies they rarely saw. Forts were built not just as bastions of power, but as fragile islands of control in a sea of forest where even a supply wagon risked ambush. Firearms existed on both sides of this contest, but they were crude by later standards. The smoothbore musket, common among European soldiers and native warriors alike, was a short-range weapon, fast to load but inaccurate beyond 50 or 60 yards. It was often used to break the shock of a charge or fire into a group before closing the distance with tomahawks, knives, or war clubs. For native fighters, the musket was simply another tool, one that complemented the bow's silent reach or the ambush's sudden strike. Warfare remained intimate and personal. The moment of decision was still measured in feet rather than yards. In the clash of bodies, rather than the arc of a bullet through the air, the frontier itself was not a single war, but a series of overlapping struggles. British settlers pushed westward from the Atlantic seaboard, clearing land and building homesteads deep into territories long held by native nations. French traders forged alliances along the rivers, weaving networks of kinship and commerce that tied their fortunes to indigenous partners. Native nations themselves fought not only against the encroachments of Europe, but also against rival peoples, as they had for centuries, seeking control of hunting grounds, trade routes, and prestige. Yet as competition grew fiercer and the stakes higher, the balance of power remained remarkably stable. Native warriors held a decisive advantage in their knowledge of the land and their mastery of irregular warfare, while European settlers brought organization, fortifications, and ever-increasing numbers. It was a contest that, for a time, neither side could decisively win. The forest remained the great equalizer, swallowing armies, isolating forts, and rendering many European tactics useless. But in the decades to come, a single innovation would begin to shift that balance. It would not be a larger army or a new treaty, but a weapon built in small frontier workshops, one that could strike farther and more accurately than anything the wilderness had yet seen. Long before native scouts glimpsed its deadly reach across an open clearing, the Kentucky rifle was already quietly reshaping the future of this struggle, and with it, the fate of the continent. The forests of eastern North America were more than just home to the Shawnee, Cherokee, Delaware, and dozens of other nations. They were an ally, a shield, and a weapon. Every river bend, every ridgeline, every hollow path beneath the canopy was part of a vast, living battlefield that had shaped their methods of war for centuries. Conflict here was not decided by marching columns or grand set-piece battles, but by who could disappear into the trees and strike before the enemy even knew they were there. In these woodlands, war was an art of patience, silence, and deadly precision, and the warriors who mastered it were feared by all who ventured into their world. Young men learned the craft of war long before they ever carried a weapon. From childhood, they practiced moving soundlessly through the underbrush, reading animal tracks and sensing the smallest change in wind or light. A rustling leaf or a snapped twig could betray an entire war party, so discipline was absolute. In training hunts and mock raids, elders taught them how to move as a single organism, how to melt into the trees and appear again where no one expected. Courage was essential, but so too was cunning. A warrior who charged too soon or revealed himself too early was not brave. He was reckless. Success was measured not by the size of an army, but by the swiftness and surprise of the strike. Traditional weapons reflected this intimate style of combat. The bow remained a favored tool for generations, valued for its silence, speed, and reliability. A skilled archer could loose a flurry of arrows before an enemy had time to reload a musket, and in the dense forests, most fights unfolded at ranges where arrows were just as lethal as bullets. Tomahawks and war clubs were carried as extensions of the hand, lightweight yet devastating in close quarters. Many were crafted with stone or iron heads, balanced for throwing as well as for striking, and their use was honed through countless skirmishes and hunting trips. A warrior could close the distance in seconds, finishing a fight before an opponent even brought his musket to bear. Trade with Europeans introduced new tools, and native warriors adapted them with remarkable speed and ingenuity. The flintlock musket, once a foreign novelty, became a trusted companion in raids and ambushes. Though slow to reload and inaccurate at long distances, it offered a burst of firepower that could break an enemy's formation or deliver a killing shot before a charge. Many warriors customized their firearms with carved stocks, shortened barrels, or decorative inlays, blending old traditions with new technology. But even with muskets in their hands, the fundamentals of woodland warfare did not change. Surprise, mobility, and knowledge of the terrain mattered more than the weapon itself. Ambush remained the defining tactic. Scouts would study enemy movements for days, learning their routines and anticipating where they would pass. War parties set traps along trails, hiding behind fallen logs, or crouched low in riverbeds, waiting for the perfect moment. When they struck, it was sudden and overwhelming. A coordinated storm of arrows, musket fire, and war cries that shattered discipline and sowed panic. Victories were often won in the first moments, and before reinforcements could respond, the attackers melted back into the forest, leaving behind silence and fear. Mobility made them nearly impossible to pursue. War parties traveled light, often with nothing but weapons, a small pouch of dried food, and a water skin. They covered enormous distances in a short time, striking settlements hundreds of miles apart without warning. This unpredictability made them a nightmare for European troops, trained to fight in lines and march in columns. Even experienced frontier militias struggled to adapt, their heavier equipment and rigid discipline ill-suited to chasing an enemy that refused to stand and fight on their terms. What made these warriors so formidable was not just their skill with weapons, but their complete harmony. With the land and their refusal to fight a battle they could not win. They understood that in the dense, unforgiving wilderness, the environment itself could be their greatest ally. Rivers could isolate an enemy column, fog could hide an approach, and a patch of swamp could swallow cavalry whole. Every natural feature was a tool in their arsenal. To outsiders, it often seemed as though the forest itself was on their side. For centuries, these tactics held back better armed and more numerous foes. Settlers feared the suddenness of a dawn raid or the eerie silence before an ambush. Soldiers learned that discipline and formations meant little when arrows and musket balls came from unseen hands. In the woodlands, power was not measured by numbers or technology, but by knowledge, stealth, and timing. Qualities the Shawnee, Cherokee, Delaware, and their neighbors possessed in abundance. But the balance would not remain unchanged forever. Beyond the ridgelines and rivers, a weapon was taking shape that could reach across the very distances that once kept warriors safe. Its arrival would stretch the battlefield and test the effectiveness of these ancient ways of war in ways none of them could have imagined. On paper, the long rifle should never have changed the balance of power on the frontier. It was slower to load than the standard musket, more expensive to make and far more delicate to maintain. In a world where most battles were decided at 50 paces or less, where war parties collided in the thickets and musket volleys roared at near point-blank range, a weapon that took nearly a full minute to reload seemed like an impractical curiosity. And yet, in the hands of the backcountry settlers who built and carried it, the long rifle transformed from a hunting tool into a weapon that altered the course of wars. The rifle that would one day terrify warriors on the frontier did not emerge from royal arsenals or government foundries. It was born instead in smoke-darkened workshops tucked into the back alleys of small settlements, forged by the hands of men whose names rarely appeared in any history book. These were the gunsmiths of the American backcountry, immigrants, artisans, and stubborn innovators who shaped steel and wood not for kings or generals, but for farmers, trappers, and hunters trying to survive in a land where the nearest help might be 100 miles away. In their forges, the future of warfare was being quietly assembled, piece by piece, long before anyone realized how revolutionary their work would become. Most of these craftsmen had come from Europe, many from the German states, where rifle-making had a long tradition. They brought with them an intimate understanding of metallurgy, barrel forging, and the mathematics of rifling, skills honed over generations. But the New World demanded more than tradition. In Europe, rifles were luxury items for noble hunts or specialist marksmen. On the frontier, they were tools of survival. A gun had to be light enough to carry on a week-long hunt, accurate enough to drop game from across a clearing, and reliable enough to defend a cabin against both wild animals and human enemies. That necessity drove innovation in ways that no imperial arsenal ever had to consider. Workshops were often little more than log structures with dirt floors, their walls lined with files, rasps, and hammers. Barrels were forged by hand from strips of wrought iron, heated and wrapped into long tubes before being hammer-welded into a single piece. The process was painstaking, and every flaw risked disaster when powder ignited behind the ball. Rifling, the spiral grooves that gave the long rifle its deadly accuracy, was cut one groove at a time by hand, using machines the gunsmiths often built themselves. Each turn of the crank shaved a hair's breadth of metal from the inside of the barrel, and it could take days to complete a single weapon. Yet those slow, careful cuts were what transformed a simple firearm into something extraordinary. Length was another frontier innovation. European rifles were often short and heavy, optimized for stalking deer in thick forests. But American gunsmiths began stretching the barrels, some to over 40 inches. The longer barrel allowed powder to burn more completely, increasing velocity and flattening the bullet's trajectory. It also gave the shooter a longer sight radius, making precise aim easier at extended ranges. Settlers who once had to stalk within 50 yards of a deer could now take clean shots from twice that distance. In a world where food meant survival, that extra reach could be the difference between life and death. They also experimented endlessly with the twist of the rifling, the rate at which the grooves spiraled down the barrel. A slow twist stabilized a larger ball at long range, while a faster twist improved accuracy at shorter distances. Through trial and error, they found the ideal balance for the small-caliber lead balls commonly used on the frontier. Powder charges were tested and adjusted too, with gunsmiths noting how different mixtures affected velocity and recoil. What emerged from this relentless experimentation was not a standardized weapon, but a spectrum of custom-built rifles, each tuned to its owner's needs and the landscape he hunted or fought in. These men were not just craftsmen, but scientists in their own right. They kept notebooks filled with measurements and observations, passed down techniques from master to apprentice, and shared ideas across settlements. Some decorated their rifles with intricate carvings and brass inlays, blending function with artistry. Others produced plain, rugged weapons meant only to fire straight and true. But all of them contributed to an evolving tradition that transformed the rifle from a niche hunting tool into a precision weapon unmatched anywhere else in the world. What set the frontier gunsmiths apart was their independence. They were not bound by military doctrine or royal contracts. They answered only to the demands of the wilderness and the people who lived in it. This freedom allowed them to experiment without fear of failure and to pursue solutions that European armories, focused on mass production and battlefield logistics, would never have considered. The result was a weapon that was uniquely American in character, practical, adaptable, and devastatingly effective in the environment where it was born. By the mid-18th century, these nameless innovators had created something no professional army could match. Their rifles could drop a man at 200 yards with a single shot, a feat unimaginable to soldiers still carrying smoothbore muskets. And though they worked in obscurity, the weapons they crafted would soon speak for them on the frontier. From the Ohio Valley to the Appalachians, warriors and soldiers alike would learn to fear a shot fired from nowhere, its source invisible, its range astonishing, the legacy of men who shaped steel and wood with their bare hands in the heart of a wilderness. The first time a long rifle cracked across a valley, many who heard it did not understand what had happened. It was not the heavy, booming report of a musket fired at close quarters, nor the familiar whistle of an arrow slicing through the air. Often there was no sound at all, only the dull thud of a bullet striking wood or flesh far beyond the distance where battle usually began. For centuries, warriors had measured the danger of an enemy by how close they were willing to come. Bows and tomahawks required proximity, and even the flintlock muskets that filtered into native hands through trade rarely threatened anyone beyond 60 or 70 yards. On that familiar battlefield, instincts were finely tuned. A scout might judge a musket's range by sight and sound, knowing when to press forward and when to hold back. The long rifle made those instincts unreliable, even deadly. The earliest encounters were confusing as much as they were terrifying. Shawnee scouts shadowing a group of settlers near the Ohio River in the 1750s reported that men were dropping from cover without warning, their killers nowhere in sight. The range between the two groups was thought to be safe, more than 200 paces, a distance from which no musket could reliably hit a man-sized target. Yet one by one, the scouts were struck down, each shot arriving without warning, often without even the telltale puff of smoke visible through the dense trees. To the warriors watching from the tree line, it seemed as if death itself had learned to travel farther than before. War parties accustomed to closing the gap quickly found themselves pinned down long before they reached striking distance. A charging force that had once needed only seconds to cross the danger zone now had to advance hundreds of yards under accurate fire. Arrows and musket balls, once matched evenly in range, could not reach their targets before the first wave of rifle shots tore into them. In one account from the upper Ohio Valley, a group of Delaware warriors attempting to ambush a frontier militia watched in astonishment as 2 of their number were hit before they had even emerged from the tree line. The attackers withdrew rather than press forward into a field where the enemy could kill them before they could fire a single shot. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical one. Traditional tactics were built on control of distance, on knowing when you were safe and when you were not. The long rifle blurred those boundaries. Warriors could no longer rely on the cover of a ravine or the safety of a river's far bank. Scouts learned that even the crest of a hill was not beyond danger. Every advance became more cautious, every decision more fraught with uncertainty. That uncertainty was precisely what the rifle's users relied on. Settlers who had grown up shooting deer across long clearings now turned those same skills against human targets, picking off scouts before a battle began and scattering war parties before they could form a plan. The invisibility of the threat added another layer of fear. A musket volley was unmistakable, a flash, a roar, a wall of smoke that betrayed the enemy's position. A rifleman, by contrast, could fire from deep cover and remain unseen. The narrow column of smoke from a single shot vanished quickly among the trees, leaving warriors guessing where the next bullet would come from. Some war parties tried to flush riflemen out with feints and sudden rushes, but even those often ended in disaster. A man who rose from cover to draw fire might fall before he had taken 2 steps. With every engagement, the legends grew. Stories spread of settlers who could hit a running man at distances too great to measure by pace, of riflemen who felled warriors from across rivers or ravines, of shots that struck so suddenly they seemed to come from nowhere at all. These tales were not exaggerations. A skilled marksman could reliably hit a target at 200 yards, and some could do so even farther. That kind of range was not just a tactical advantage. It rewrote the entire language of war. The rifle's extended reach did more than change the mathematics of battle. It altered the rhythm and the psychology of conflict itself. No longer could warriors rely on the moment when distance closed and courage carried them forward. Now the killing began long before the two sides ever saw each other's faces. Scouts who once ranged confidently ahead of a war party now moved with hesitation, knowing that an unseen rifleman might be watching from beyond the horizon of their experience. The very nature of the battlefield was expanding, and with it, the rules that had governed woodland warfare for generations were beginning to unravel. The Ohio Valley in the mid-18th century was a land in transition, a contested wilderness where thick forests met rolling plains and rivers, carved winding paths through unclaimed territories. It was here, in this rugged and dangerous borderland, that the long rifle began to reveal its true potential. Small bands of settlers, hunters, and militiamen, often outnumbered and isolated, found themselves fighting against seasoned native war parties who had mastered the terrain for generations. What they lacked in numbers, they compensated for with a new kind of reach. These early skirmishes were rarely large enough to earn a place in official histories, but their impact rippled across the frontier, rewriting not just tactics but the psychology of conflict itself. One of the first of these confrontations occurred near the forks of the Ohio in the early 1750s, as European settlers began pushing deeper into lands long controlled by the Shawnee and Delaware. A small scouting party of frontiersmen, armed with the new long rifles, spotted a group of warriors moving along a wooded ridge several hundred yards away. In earlier times, such a sighting would have prompted one of two choices: retreat to avoid being detected, or prepare for a close engagement once the war party approached within musket range. Instead, the settlers took aim. The first shot struck a warrior dead at a distance that would have been considered impossible just a decade before. The rest of the group scattered into the trees, shaken by a shot fired from what they had assumed was safety. Encounters like this began to multiply. At a skirmish along the Licking River, a dozen settlers defending a makeshift blockhouse held off a far larger Shawnee force for nearly a day, never allowing their attackers to close in. Each time the warriors tried to approach, rifle fire erupted from hidden positions hundreds of yards away, forcing them to retreat before they could even loose a volley. The settlers fired deliberately and sparingly. They could not afford to waste powder or reveal their positions, but each shot that found its mark eroded the confidence of their attackers. In the past, overwhelming numbers and aggressive tactics had often carried the day. Now numbers meant less when advancing meant exposing oneself to lethal fire long before the fighting began. Perhaps the most telling example came during a raid near Harrodsburg, Kentucky, in the 1770s. A mixed war party, confident in their ability to overrun the small settlement, advanced under cover of trees and brush, expecting to close quickly with tomahawks and muskets. They never got the chance. Riflemen hidden behind logs and earthworks began firing at extraordinary distances, felling warriors before they were even visible to the naked eye. The survivors tried to regroup and approach under heavier cover, but each movement was met with another shot. The attack was abandoned before it had truly begun. The defenders had fired fewer than 30 rounds, yet the outcome was decisive. These engagements had a cumulative effect on both sides. For native warriors, accustomed to battles decided by speed, shock, and proximity, the extended range of the rifle introduced a new and unsettling dynamic. Charging into combat now meant crossing a deadly zone where they were vulnerable but unable to strike back. Ambushes, once their most reliable tactic, became riskier as scouts, and forward elements were picked off before they could set traps. Even their approach routes had to change. Open ground, once considered an inconvenience, became a killing field. For settlers, the psychological shift was equally significant. Small groups who would once have fled or barricaded themselves in despair now held their ground with confidence. They learned to fight from concealment, to use elevation and open terrain to their advantage, and to let the enemy come to them. The long rifle allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement, forcing their opponents to move, expose themselves, and take risks they would not otherwise take. In this way, even a handful of riflemen could control the pace of a battle against far larger forces. What these early skirmishes proved was that warfare in the American wilderness was no longer bound by the same limits that had governed it for centuries. Distance itself had become a weapon. Battles began long before the two sides ever saw each other's faces, and the first casualties often fell before either side had spoken a war cry or fired a volley. The forest, once a shield for those who knew it best, could no longer guarantee safety. With each clash, the rifle extended the invisible frontier of danger farther and farther out, reshaping not just how men fought, but how they thought about fighting at all. By the time larger conflicts erupted, both native warriors and colonial militias understood that the ground beneath their feet and the distances they thought they could trust had changed forever. In the summer of 1774, tension in the Ohio Valley reached a breaking point. Decades of encroachment by settlers onto Shawnee and Mingo lands had ignited a series of retaliatory raids and reprisals, culminating in a conflict that would come to be known as Dunmore's War. For the Shawnee, led by the formidable Chief Cornstalk, war was not just about defense, it was about restoring balance and deterring further invasion. Their tactics were time-honored and devastatingly effective. Strike unseen, close quickly, and overwhelm before the enemy could respond. Yet on the wooded slopes near the banks of the Kanawha River, that approach would meet an enemy it had never faced before, one who could kill from distances that made those tactics obsolete. The encounter that would expose this new reality began as a carefully laid trap. Cornstalk had assembled several hundred warriors, many of them veterans of raids and ambushes across the frontier. They knew the habits of colonial militias, their tendency to march in tight formations, their reliance on close volleys, their vulnerability to sudden flanking attacks. The Shawnee plan was simple and sound. They would let the Virginians advance deep into the forested ravines near Point Pleasant, then strike from multiple sides at once. The shock of the ambush, followed by swift hand-to-hand combat, would scatter the column and allow the warriors to cut them down as they fled. What they did not anticipate was how far the fight would begin before the ambush could spring. Among the colonial force were frontiersmen, Men who had grown up in the wilderness, who had hunted deer at 200 yards and could hit a squirrel from the length of a field. They carried long rifles rather than standard-issue muskets, and they had no intention of letting their enemy dictate the terms of the battle. As the Virginians moved through the dense woods, scouts ahead of the main column spotted faint movement in the underbrush. Rather than advance blindly into the kill zone, they fanned out and began firing at distances that seemed absurd to the Shawnee. The first shots landed before the warriors were even visible. One was struck through the chest as he crouched behind a tree. Another hit while moving into position more than 150 yards from the nearest soldier. The ambush dissolved before it had begun. Instead of charging forward into a disoriented column, the Shawnee found themselves pinned down, taking fire from an enemy they could not reach. Attempts to close the distance were met with withering accuracy. Warriors who sprinted from one tree to another fell before they crossed half the ground. Others tried circling wide to flank the riflemen, only to find themselves exposed in open glades where the settlers' shots found them with deadly precision. The battle became a grinding stalemate, not the swift, decisive ambush the Shawnee had planned. Cornstalk's warriors were forced into a defensive fight, exchanging sporadic musket fire from cover but unable to press an advantage. Each attempt to maneuver closer ended in losses. The Virginians, meanwhile, fought on their own terms. They used the terrain to maintain distance, retreating just enough to keep the enemy at the edge of their effective range while continuing to pick off targets one by one. The discipline and patience of the riflemen frustrated every effort to bring the fight into familiar territory. By the end of the day, the Battle of Point Pleasant had become a harsh lesson in how warfare on the frontier was changing. The Shawnee had inflicted casualties and fought with their usual ferocity, but their plan, built around speed, proximity, and surprise, had failed against an enemy who refused to allow them within striking range. Long rifles had turned the very concept of an ambush on its head. No longer could warriors count on the first blow being theirs. No longer could they assume that distance was their ally until the moment they chose to close it. The aftermath of the battle was sobering. Cornstalk, recognizing the shift, sued for peace before the year's end, knowing that continued conflict against foes who could strike from so far away would drain his people's strength. For the settlers, the lesson was equally clear. With the right weapon and the right tactics, even small militias could neutralize the advantages that native warriors had relied on for generations. The frontier would still be contested, still brutal and uncertain, but the invisible lines that once defined safety and danger had shifted. Where once a war party could wait unseen and unleash chaos at 30 paces, now they risked death before they were close enough to even shout a war cry. The ambush, the most feared weapon in woodland warfare, was no longer a guarantee of victory, and for those who had built their strategies around it, that realization changed everything. By the summer of 1778, the frontier settlement of Boonesborough was little more than a cluster of rough cabins and a wooden palisade in the heart of what was then Kentucky's untamed wilderness. It was remote, isolated and vulnerable, a fragile outpost of colonial expansion surrounded by lands that had long belonged to the Shawnee and their allies. Yet its very existence made it a symbol of defiance, and for Daniel Boone, the man who had carved the settlement out of the forest, it was a place he was determined to hold no matter the odds. That determination would soon be tested in one of the most remarkable sieges of the era, a confrontation that would show just how much the long rifle had changed the rules of frontier warfare. The siege of Boonesborough did not happen by chance. Months earlier, Boone had been captured by a Shawnee war party while leading a group of men to collect salt. Taken to their towns north of the Ohio River, he was adopted into the tribe and treated with respect, even as they hoped to use his knowledge to undermine the settlements spreading westward. Boone eventually escaped and raced back to Boonesborough, warning the settlers that a major attack was imminent. He knew what was coming. A coalition of several hundred warriors determined to wipe the tiny settlement off the map. The defenders numbered fewer than 60 men. On paper, it was not a fight they could win. In early September, the Shawnee appeared in force under the leadership of Chief Blackfish, surrounding the fort and demanding its surrender. Boone refused. The first assaults came quickly, probing attacks meant to test the settlers' defenses and draw them into the open. But the riflemen inside Boonesborough stayed behind their walls, conserving ammunition and picking their shots with care. Each time a warrior showed himself in the open, a sharp crack echoed from the fort, and someone fell. The attackers were used to closing the distance quickly and engaging in close combat, but the long rifles denied them that opportunity. At ranges where a musket ball would have gone wild, the settlers' shots remained deadly accurate. When the Shawnee tried to storm the palisade directly, the rifle fire was devastating. Warriors advancing across the open ground were struck long before they reached the walls, forcing them to retreat before they could even lay ladders. Attempts to burn the fort with fire arrows and flaming brush failed for the same reason. Anyone who lingered in sight of the riflemen did not last long. The attackers then switched tactics, digging shallow trenches and attempting to tunnel beneath the walls to breach the defenses. Boone's men responded by digging counter-trenches of their own and continuing their deadly fire whenever a head or shoulder appeared above the earthworks. For 10 days, the siege continued. The attackers outnumbered the defenders more than 5 to 1, but every time they pressed the attack, they were driven back by well-placed shots. The settlers rationed their powder carefully, firing only when they were certain of a hit, while women and older boys molded bullets and carried water under fire. The fort's defenders became so confident in their marksmanship that some took to firing at small targets, a feather in a warrior's hair, the edge of a shield, to demoralize their enemy. Stories from the siege speak of warriors unwilling to expose even an arm above a log for fear of being hit. The psychological toll on the attackers grew heavier with each failed assault. The Shawnee had expected to overwhelm the tiny settlement quickly, as they had done with others before. Instead, they found themselves losing men and momentum without ever breaching the walls. Their tactics, honed over generations for ambushes, raids, and close-quarters fighting, were useless against a foe that could kill from distances that defied belief. After more than a week of costly fighting, the siege was abandoned. The coalition melted back into the forest, leaving Boonesborough scarred but unbroken. The defense of Boonesborough became legend almost immediately, celebrated not just as a triumph of courage, but as proof of the transformative power of the long rifle. Without it, Boone and his men could never have held the fort. The rifle allowed them to fight from behind their walls with precision and patience, inflicting far greater casualties than their numbers should have allowed. It bought them time, discouraged repeated assaults, and turned every open yard outside the palisade into a killing field. The siege also signaled a deeper shift in the balance of power on the frontier. If a handful of settlers could stand against hundreds of warriors using little more than determination and accurate fire, then the days when numbers alone could decide a fight were over. When the smoke cleared, Boonesborough remained, battered, weathered, but still standing. For the Shawnee, it was a sobering lesson in how technology had reshaped the frontier. For Boone and his people, it was a vindication of their belief that they could carve out a future in hostile territory. And for all who heard the story, it was a reminder that the range of the long rifle was more than just a measure of distance. It was a force that could decide the fate of entire communities. The long rifle had changed the nature of warfare on the frontier, but it had not ended the fight. Both sides understood that survival now depended on adaptation, and nowhere was that more evident than in the decades that followed the first devastating encounters. Neither the native nations nor the settlers were willing to concede the wilderness, and as the struggle deepened, both sides reshaped their tactics in response to the other. What emerged was not a one-sided contest, but a deadly evolution, a kind of arms race in strategy and technique that turned the forests of the Ohio Valley and Kentucky into a shadow war of ambushes, deception and precision. Native warriors, Long masters of irregular warfare were among the first to adapt. The shock of being targeted from distances, once thought impossible, forced them to reconsider how they approached battle. No longer could they rely on small scouting parties advancing ahead of the main force. Those scouts were now prime targets for distant riflemen. Instead, they began using decoys, warriors deliberately exposing themselves to draw fire and reveal the enemy's position. Once the first shots rang out, the main body would maneuver to flank the riflemen or charge from another direction. It was a dangerous tactic, but it often worked, especially against less disciplined settlers who could not resist taking the first shot. Coordinated charges also became more sophisticated. Rather than rushing en masse into a storm of rifle fire, war parties broke into smaller groups, attacking from multiple angles to divide the defenders' attention. Some moved under cover of smoke from burning brush, while others used the terrain, dry creek beds, fallen logs, dense undergrowth, to close the distance unseen. These tactics could turn the advantage of range into a liability. A rifleman isolated from his companions or distracted by one direction might find warriors at his flank before he had time to reload. Night raids, too, grew more common and more elaborate. Darkness neutralized the long rifle's greatest strength, its precision at range. Under cover of night, warriors crept close enough to set fire to cabins, steal horses, or kill livestock, forcing settlers out into the open where numbers and chaos favored the attackers. The sound of war cries and musket fire in the dark was often enough to paralyze a settlement with fear. A handful of warriors could keep a larger force awake and exhausted for days, wearing down their defenses without ever risking a pitched battle. The settlers, for their part, learned quickly that static defense and long-range sniping were not enough. Frontier life demanded mobility, and militia units began organizing themselves into small, flexible companies that could fight in the same ways their enemies did. These rifle companies trained in camouflage and concealment, learning to blend into the woods with buckskins dyed in earth tones and faces smeared with soot or mud. They practiced moving silently through dense underbrush, forming ambush lines, and coordinating fire from multiple positions, skills directly borrowed from their opponents. Settler tactics increasingly emphasized patience and precision. A single, well-placed shot at the right moment could turn the tide of a fight. Riflemen learned to wait until the enemy was exposed, firing not into crowds but at key targets. A war leader giving orders, a warrior carrying a powder horn, or a man about to light a fire beneath a palisade wall. In some engagements, they used deception of their own, staging false retreats to lure attackers into crossfire or deliberately missing a shot to draw them into the open. They also developed their own raiding techniques, striking deep into enemy territory to destroy food stores, burn villages, and disrupt alliances before war parties could gather strength. As the conflict matured, the line between settler and native tactics blurred. Each side borrowed from the other, refining what worked and discarding what did not. War parties used captured rifles to deadly effect, while colonial militias adopted native methods of communication, silent hand signals, bird calls, and even smoke patterns to coordinate movements over long distances. Engagements became chess matches played in shadow and silence, where the side that understood the terrain and anticipated the other's moves held the upper hand. But even as tactics evolved, the human cost of this new style of war grew heavier. Villages were burned in retaliation for raids, and retaliatory expeditions destroyed entire communities. No battle was decisive, yet none were without consequence. Each skirmish left behind grief, bitterness, and a deepening resolve on both sides. It was a war fought without clear front lines, where every forest trail and river crossing might hide an ambush, and every flicker of firelight might be the start of an attack. By the end of the 18th century, both native nations and settlers had transformed themselves into highly adaptive, highly mobile fighting forces. The rifle had extended the reach of death, but skill and ingenuity determined who survived. The forests of the frontier became a proving ground where tradition and innovation collided, and where every lesson learned was paid for in blood. When the first shots of the American Revolution rang out in 1775, they were fired by men who had learned to fight not on European parade grounds, but in the tangled forests and river valleys of the frontier. For decades, these settlers had been locked in a brutal, shifting struggle with native nations, learning to stalk, hide, and shoot with a precision that few professional armies could match. By the time open war with Britain erupted, these skills, forged in countless ambushes and raids, had created a new kind of soldier, the American rifleman. Armed with long rifles and hardened by years of irregular warfare, they would become one of the most feared and effective elements of the Continental cause. The British Army that arrived in North America came from a tradition of formal warfare. Its soldiers were drilled to fight in tight formations, advancing shoulder to shoulder and delivering massed volleys at short range. On European battlefields, this discipline and firepower were devastating. But in the forests and hills of the colonies, where visibility was often limited and engagement scattered, it was a liability. Riflemen thrived in precisely those conditions. They did not fight in lines or wait for orders to fire. They moved independently, often in small groups, choosing their targets carefully and firing from cover at distances the British had never experienced before. The first major demonstration of their effectiveness came in the campaigns around Boston and New York. Colonial rifle companies, many recruited from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky, used their long-range fire to harass British patrols, pick off officers, and disrupt supply convoys. A British soldier marching confidently down a wooded road could suddenly fall dead without ever seeing who had fired the shot. Even the most disciplined regiments found it difficult to maintain formation under such conditions, and morale suffered as men realized they were being targeted from beyond the reach of their own muskets. At the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, this deadly accuracy played a decisive role. American riflemen under Colonel Daniel Morgan were positioned on the flanks, using the dense forest to conceal their movements. As the British advanced, Morgan's men focused their fire on officers and artillery crews, sowing confusion and slowing the enemy's advance. One of the most famous moments of the battle came when sharpshooter Timothy Murphy, firing from a tree, killed British General Simon Fraser at a distance of more than 300 yards, an almost unthinkable shot for the era. Fraser's death threw British command into disarray, contributing directly to their defeat and surrender, a turning point that convinced France to join the war on the American side. British and Loyalist forces were not the only ones to feel the sting of the rifle. Many native warriors, allied with the Crown, also found themselves on the receiving end of tactics they had once used so effectively. Frontier riflemen applied the same methods they had developed against native war parties: ambushes, silent stalking, and precision targeting, to deadly effect. They avoided direct confrontations when possible, instead striking from the shadows and disappearing before a counterattack could form. In many ways, the Revolution's backcountry campaigns were a continuation of the same frontier war that had been raging for decades. Only now with global stakes, the British tried to adapt, deploying their own light infantry and German Jaeger riflemen to counter the American sharpshooters. But even these units struggled to match the experience and marksmanship of men who had spent their lives shooting for survival. Colonial riflemen could load and fire from unconventional positions, hit targets on the move, and make use of natural cover with instinctive ease. They turned every forest, ravine, and hillside into a battlefield on their terms, forcing British forces to fight a war they had never trained for. Even outside of major battles, their impact was significant. Riflemen were often used in reconnaissance, raiding, and harassment operations, wearing down the enemy's will to fight. They disrupted communication lines, ambushed foraging parties, and made supply routes hazardous. Their presence forced British commanders to divert troops to guard duties and delayed campaigns that relied on secure movement. This constant pressure, combined with conventional battles fought by the Continental Army, created a two-front struggle that stretched British resources thin and eroded their confidence. By the end of the war, the rifleman had become a symbol of the American fight, a figure who embodied the resourcefulness, independence and resilience of the revolution itself. They were not soldiers in the European sense. They were hunters, woodsmen and militiamen whose skills had been sharpened by years of survival on a dangerous frontier. The British had come expecting to crush a rebellion with superior firepower and discipline. Instead, they found themselves hunted by men who could kill from beyond their reach, who refused to stand still and fight by the old rules, and who turned the very wilderness against them. The lessons learned from decades of conflict with native nations had become one of the revolution's greatest weapons, and one of Britain's most persistent nightmares. By the early years of the 19th century, the world that the Shawnee and their neighbors had known for generations was changing beyond recognition. The forests of the Ohio Valley were thinning under the axes of settlers. Rivers once controlled by native nations now carried boats loaded with supplies for distant towns, and treaties signed under pressure were carving away ancestral lands piece by piece. The long rifle, once an unfamiliar tool in the hands of distant enemies, was now a permanent presence, a symbol of the technological and tactical power that had made westward expansion possible. It was not lost on Tecumseh, a rising Shawnee leader, that this weapon represented more than just superior range. It was proof that scattered resistance and isolated raids could no longer hope to stem the tide. If the native nations were to survive, they would need something far greater than courage or skill. They would need unity. Tecumseh's awakening did not happen overnight. He had grown up in a world defined by constant conflict, witnessing the steady encroachment of settlers and the devastating defeats suffered by native forces who fought tribe by tribe, each for its own territory. His father had been killed in battle against colonial forces, and as a young warrior, he had fought in the Northwest Indian War, where the pattern repeated again and again: bold raids, desperate resistance, and eventual defeat at the hands of better armed, better organized foes. Even when native warriors inflicted heavy casualties, they could not sustain the fight. The enemy always returned with more men, more supplies, and more rifles. The weapon's influence was more than physical. It changed the very nature of power. Where once warriors could rely on speed and surprise to even the odds, the long rifle extended danger far beyond the reach of traditional tactics. Villages could be shelled from across rivers, scouts could be shot before they were close enough to see, and battles could be lost before the two sides ever met face to face. Tecumseh understood that as long as native resistance remained fragmented, each nation would be defeated in turn, their warriors scattered and their lands consumed. The rifle's reach made it clear they could no longer afford to fight alone. It was around this time that his younger brother, Tecumseh, known as the Prophet, began preaching a powerful message of cultural renewal and unity. He called on native peoples to reject the ways of the settlers, to abandon alcohol, manufactured goods, and dependence on trade, and to return to the old ways. His spiritual movement resonated deeply, drawing followers from dozens of tribes. Tecumseh saw in his brother's message the foundation for something more ambitious, a political and military alliance that would unite the fragmented nations of the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley into a single force capable of resisting American expansion. Together, the brothers envisioned a confederation stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, one that would speak with a single voice and fight with a single will. Tecumseh traveled tirelessly, meeting with the Potawatomi, the Wyandot, the Creek, the Choctaw, and many others, urging them to put aside old rivalries and see the settlers as a common enemy. He argued that no treaty signed by one tribe was valid unless all agreed, a radical notion that directly challenged U.S. policy, which relied on exploiting divisions and securing land piecemeal. He spoke not just of defending territory, but of reclaiming dignity and sovereignty, of preserving a way of life under siege. Everywhere he went, Tecumseh pointed to the rifle as both a warning and a rallying cry. It was a weapon that symbolized the enemy's strength, but also their vulnerability. If the tribes could unite, they could match fire with fire, ambush supply lines, strike settlements before they were fortified, and present a force so large that no single army could crush it. He knew that even the most powerful weapon could not conquer a determined and united people. The dream of a continent-wide resistance began to take shape. In 1808, the brothers established Prophetstown, near the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers, a settlement meant to be both a spiritual center and a rallying point for their movement. Warriors from far-flung nations gathered there, sharing news, exchanging tactics, and forging alliances that had once seemed impossible. For a brief moment, it appeared that Tecumseh's vision might succeed, but such unity was a direct threat to American expansion, and it would not go unchallenged. The United States responded with force, culminating in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where Tenskwatawa's followers clashed with U.S. troops under William Henry Harrison. The battle ended in defeat for the Confederation, and Prophetstown was destroyed. Yet even in setback, Tecumseh's message endured. He continued his efforts, allying with the British during the War of 1812, and leading warriors into battle until his death in 1813. Tecumseh's awakening was more than a response to the rifle's deadly reach. It was a recognition of the deeper truth it revealed. Technology had shifted the balance of power, and the old ways of fighting were no longer enough. Only unity could match such strength. Though his dream was never fully realized, his vision of a united native front left a legacy that echoed long after his death, a testament to one man's understanding that survival in a changing world required more than bravery. It required transformation. The morning of November 7th, 1811, dawned cold and damp along the banks of the Tippecanoe River in what is now Indiana. A heavy mist clung to the forest floor, muffling the sounds of movement and turning the battlefield into a world of shifting shadows. Beneath that grey light, two very different visions for the future of North America were about to collide. On one side stood roughly 1,000 warriors drawn from a coalition of tribes, inspired by Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa. The prophet, on the other, was a force of about 1,000 American soldiers and militia under Governor William Henry Harrison, sent to break the growing Native Confederation before it could threaten U.S. expansion. The clash that followed would not be the largest or bloodiest of the era, but it would mark a turning point, a moment when the long rifle proved beyond doubt that it had changed the rules of frontier war. Tensions had been building for years. Tecumseh was away in the south, attempting to bring more nations into his alliance, when Harrison led his force northward toward Prophetstown, the spiritual and political heart of the Confederation. Tenskwatawa, left in command, faced a critical choice: negotiate or fight. Believing the Americans vulnerable, he chose the latter. On the night of November 6th, he ordered a surprise attack on Harrison's camp before dawn. A classic tactic designed to create chaos and panic, overwhelm the enemy before they could form ranks, and win the day through speed and ferocity. But the Americans were not caught completely unprepared. Their camp was arranged in a defensive triangle with rifles and muskets stacked and ready, and sentries on watch. Shortly before first light, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the pre-dawn silence, an early warning that robbed the attackers of their full surprise. Moments later, warriors erupted from the tree line, charging through the mist with war cries that echoed through the camp. In earlier decades, such an assault might have broken a militia line. But the men who stood waiting that morning were not raw recruits. Many were veterans of frontier skirmishes, trained in the same hit-and-run tactics their enemies had perfected. More importantly, many carried long rifles, weapons that allowed them to meet the charge long before it reached their lines. As the warriors closed the distance, they were met with a deadly rain of fire. Riflemen aimed deliberately, picking out individuals in the advancing ranks. Shots struck from 70, 100, even 150 yards, distances at which smoothbore muskets would have been ineffective. The momentum of the assault faltered as men fell well before they could swing a tomahawk or fire a musket of their own. Warriors attempted to press forward through the storm of lead, but every step brought more casualties. Even those who made it close enough to fight found themselves outnumbered and cut down by coordinated volleys from disciplined lines. The fighting raged for more than 2 hours, a chaotic series of charges, withdrawals, and counterattacks fought in the half-light of morning. Again and again, native warriors tried to break the American formation, and again they were driven back by accurate long-range fire. At one point, a group attempted to flank the camp under cover of the riverbank, only to be discovered and shattered by riflemen firing from behind hastily built barricades. Others launched feints, hoping to draw the defenders into the open, where numbers could tell. But Harrison's men refused to give chase. They held their ground, firing deliberately and methodically until the attackers began to pull back. By mid-morning, the battle was over. Prophetstown was abandoned and later burned, and the Confederation suffered a major setback from which it would never fully recover. The Americans had lost around 60 men, but the native forces had suffered significantly higher casualties. More importantly, the psychological impact of the fight was profound. For generations, a sudden, coordinated charge had been one of the most effective tools of indigenous warfare, capable of breaking even fortified positions. At Tippecanoe, that tactic had met its match. The long rifle had extended the reach of death so far beyond the expected limits that speed and bravery alone could no longer decide the outcome. The aftermath rippled far beyond the burned remains of Prophetstown. The defeat weakened Tecumseh's Confederation and emboldened U.S. leaders to push deeper into native territory. It also cemented the rifle's place as the defining weapon of the American frontier. No longer just a tool of hunters or militias, it had become an instrument of national policy, a weapon that shaped the course of expansion and conquest. Its accuracy had blunted a charge that might once have overrun a camp, and in doing so, it demonstrated that technology could tilt even the most lopsided of contests. For the native nations, Tippecanoe was a bitter lesson. Bravery, speed, and tactical ingenuity, the qualities that had once given them the edge, were no longer enough against an enemy who could strike them down before they ever reached the fight. For the Americans, it was proof that their evolving way of war could overcome even the most determined resistance. And for everyone who witnessed it, Tippecanoe was a grim preview of the future. A future in which range and precision would rule the battlefield, and the old ways of war would never be the same again. For centuries, the art of war in the woodlands of North America had been governed by a shared understanding. A warrior's courage was proven not by how many he killed, but by how close he was willing to stand when he did it. Among the Shawnee, Cherokee, Delaware, and many others, the highest honor came from facing the enemy within sight and sound, hearing the hiss of his arrow or the clash of his tomahawk. To show one's bravery was to risk one's life openly, to meet death head-on rather than strike from the shadows. Even ambushes, though rooted in stealth, still ended with shouts, charges, and the primal chaos of men fighting within arm's reach. This code was more than tradition. It was the foundation of how warriors understood themselves, their honor, and their place in the world. The arrival of the Kentucky rifle shattered that understanding. It wasn't just the weapon's range that changed the nature of combat. It was the way it severed the link between bravery and danger. A warrior could be killed without ever seeing the man who killed him, without even knowing he was in danger. One moment he might be watching the tree line, confident that the enemy was too far to strike, and the next he would fall with a hole in his chest, the sound of the shot echoing seconds after the bullet had struck. Death no longer came with warning. It came from beyond the horizon of perception, silent, distant, and invisible. For many native warriors, this new reality was deeply unsettling. Traditional markers of courage no longer applied. Charging a fortified position or rushing a line of muskets had always been dangerous, but it had also been a test of will, a demonstration of strength and spirit. Now such acts could mean nothing more than dying long before reaching the fight. Even the bravest charge could be cut down before it began, not by superior numbers or hand-to-hand skill, but by a single man hidden hundreds of yards away. The battlefield itself had become alien, a place where courage did not guarantee survival and where skill could not guarantee victory. The psychological toll of this transformation was enormous. Scouts, who once moved confidently ahead of their parties, began to do so with hesitation, knowing that unseen eyes could be watching from impossible distances. War parties paused more often, advanced more cautiously, and abandoned attacks that would once have been routine. The constant awareness that death could strike from nowhere created an undercurrent of anxiety that eroded morale. It wasn't just the physical danger, it was the helplessness that came with it. The realization that bravery and vigilance might make no difference at all. This shift also changed the meaning of heroism in the eyes of many warriors. Stories of hand-to-hand combat and daring raids had always been told and retold as proof of a man's worth. But how did one sing of glory when the enemy was never seen? How could one prove courage when the battle was fought at distances where no war cry could be heard? In this new kind of war, victory belonged not to those who closed the gap and fought face to face, but to those who remained hidden and patient, who could wait for minutes or hours for a single perfect shot. It was a skill, but it did not feel like courage, not in the old sense. Settlers, too, recognized the psychological dimension of the rifle's power and used it deliberately. They staged ambushes where their presence would never be detected, firing a few shots and then vanishing before a counterattack could form. They positioned riflemen on distant ridges to pick off leaders and disrupt formations without ever revealing their location. In doing so, they magnified the sense of helplessness among their enemies, turning fear itself into a weapon. For native warriors steeped in a culture of visible valor, this invisible war was disorienting and infuriating. Over time, the relentless pressure of unseen fire began to reshape how native nations thought about war. Many adapted by incorporating long-range shooting into their own tactics, seizing captured rifles and training marksmen of their own. Others shifted their emphasis from individual acts of bravery to collective survival and strategy. Yet even as tactics evolved, the emotional weight of that change remained. The old warrior code, built on the belief that courage could shape destiny, was eroding under the cold logic of a weapon that cared nothing for bravery. In the end, the Kentucky rifle did more than change the mechanics of battle. It altered the very psychology of warfare. It taught that courage alone was no longer enough, that skill and spirit could be rendered meaningless by distance and precision. Death no longer demanded that one look his enemy in the eye. It could come from a man a quarter of a mile away, steadying his breath and squeezing a trigger. The age of heroic charges and close-quarters glory was giving way to something colder, more impersonal and far more terrifying, a war fought in silence, where the dead fell without ever knowing who had struck the blow. The Kentucky rifle may have reshaped the battlefield, but it did not end indigenous resistance. If anything, it forced a new wave of adaptation. Native warriors, long regarded as masters of flexibility and improvisation, responded to this new challenge not by surrendering to its power, but by learning to wield it themselves. Over time, the very weapon that had once symbolized their disadvantage became part of their arsenal, and with it came new tactics, new strategies, and new ways to fight a war that was far from over. The process began piecemeal. In the early years of conflict, rifles were rare and expensive, often too costly for trade or too tightly controlled to acquire in large numbers. But battlefields are fertile ground for change. Warriors began collecting captured rifles from skirmishes, raids, and ambushes, studying them carefully and learning how to use them. Gunsmiths and traders among the settlers, eager for profit or seeking alliances, occasionally sold or traded rifles as well. Before long, more and more native fighters were carrying long rifles into battle, not as curiosities, but as essential tools. The shift in training was equally important. Traditional warrior societies had long emphasized speed, stealth, and close-range skill, but by the early 1800s, many began incorporating marksmanship into their preparation. Younger warriors practiced with rifles just as they had once trained with bows, learning to aim patiently, fire accurately, and conserve ammunition. Scouts were taught to spot and counter enemy sharpshooters, using the terrain to approach without being seen or to flank riflemen hidden at a distance. The best marksmen gained prestige not just for their bravery, but for their ability to strike unseen. To control a battle from hundreds of yards away, some leaders went further, reorganizing their forces around the capabilities of the rifle. War parties began to include designated sharpshooters who would open engagements by targeting key individuals, officers, messengers, or anyone carrying supplies before the main force advanced. Others used rifle fire to fix an enemy in place, forcing them to seek cover while fast-moving warriors maneuvered around their flanks. The result was a more complex and layered style of warfare, one that combined the new with the old. Ambush and infiltration still played their part, but now they were often supported by carefully coordinated long-range fire. These adaptations extended beyond the battlefield. The presence of rifles changed how native nations thought about defense and territory. Villages were sometimes placed in positions that offered clear fields of fire, and lookouts were stationed farther from settlements to give riflemen more time to react to approaching threats. Hunters doubled as sharpshooters, honing their skills in the woods and bringing that expertise back to the war party. The rifle, once a symbol of foreign intrusion, became a part of everyday life, a tool for survival as much as resistance. Even as the frontier pushed relentlessly westward, this spirit of adaptation persisted. On the Great Plains, tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, who had once relied almost exclusively on horseback mobility and short-range weapons, integrated rifles into their mounted tactics. Warriors firing from horseback learned to use distance to their advantage, harassing cavalry from beyond musket range before closing in for the kill. On the northern plains and in the Rockies, rifle-armed scouts shadowed wagon trains, sniping at them from ridges and forcing settlers to slow their advance. Settlers, soldiers, and explorers who expected indigenous tactics to remain static were often caught off guard by this evolution. By the mid-19th century, U.S. Army reports frequently described native marksmen who could hit targets at astonishing distances, who fought with patience and precision rather than rushing into traditional close-range engagements. Rifle fire ambushed surveying parties, disabled artillery crews, and picked off officers in the midst of battles. The weapon that had once given settlers overwhelming superiority now gave their adversaries new ways to resist. Yet this adaptation was about more than just matching technology with technology. It was a testament to resilience, a refusal to be defined by the tools or tactics of another people. Native warriors did not simply imitate their enemies. They absorbed what was useful and made it their own, weaving it into a broader tradition of warfare that had evolved over centuries. The rifle became one more tool in a larger arsenal of knowledge, one that included deep familiarity with the land, mastery of stealth, and an unmatched ability to move and fight as part of the natural world. By the time the frontier reached the Mississippi and beyond, the Kentucky rifle's legacy had come full circle. What had begun as a weapon that symbolized settler dominance had become a shared language of war. Both sides now fought with the same weapons, often with the same tactics, and victories depended less on technology than on will, coordination, and cunning. The rifle had changed everything, but it had not broken indigenous resistance. Instead, it had transformed it, making it sharper, more disciplined, and more enduring. The story of the rifle's spread was not just one of conquest. It was also one of adaptation, a testament to the unyielding determination of peoples who refused to vanish quietly from the land that had always been their home. By the time the 19th century drew to a close, the Kentucky rifle was no longer the cutting-edge weapon it had once been. New technologies, percussion caps, rifled muskets, breech loaders, and repeating rifles had surpassed its capabilities. Yet its legacy lingered, woven into the very fabric of the continent's history. It had been more than a firearm. It had been a symbol of transformation, a catalyst that shifted the balance of power and brought an end to centuries-old ways of war. The story of the Kentucky rifle was not simply about accuracy or range. It was about what those qualities meant in a world where power had once been measured by bravery, proximity, and physical strength. Before its rise, warfare in North America was defined by closeness, by warriors who faced one another within shouting distance, who measured honor by how near they could strike and how boldly they could stand. The rifle rewrote those terms. It allowed men to shape the course of battle without ever showing their faces. It extended the reach of violence beyond the limits of human senses, and in doing so, it redefined courage and strategy alike. A fight was no longer a contest of muscle and nerve alone. It became one of patience, calculation, and engineering. Those who mastered the new reality, who understood how distance could kill and how precision could decide the outcome, gained power over those who clung to the old codes. The ripple effects were enormous. On the frontier, the rifle turned small, scattered settlements into formidable bastions. Where once a handful of cabins would have been easy prey for a large war party, they now stood as strong points capable of projecting lethal force across valleys and open ground. In battle after battle, it allowed small groups of settlers or militia to resist overwhelming numbers. It taught armies that discipline and range mattered more than raw courage, and it forced indigenous nations to reconsider the very foundations of their military traditions. The rifle did not merely tip the scales, it redrew them entirely. This transformation reached far beyond tactics. The Kentucky rifle's influence extended into politics, society, and the very shape of the continent. It helped secure colonial footholds that might otherwise have been erased. It allowed settlers to push deeper into lands once deemed untouchable. It emboldened governments to negotiate and break treaties from positions of newfound strength. In many ways, it became a silent partner in expansion, enabling the displacement of indigenous peoples and the steady westward march of farms, towns, and railroads. Behind that march lay a weapon that had given settlers not just a means to defend themselves, but the confidence to believe they could not be stopped. Yet even as it symbolized conquest and dominance, the Kentucky rifle also revealed a deeper truth, that technology, once unleashed, does not belong solely to those who invent or wield it first. Native warriors adapted it, mastered it, and in many cases turned it against those who had introduced it. Armies studied its lessons and built upon them, designing weapons that could fire faster, farther, and with deadlier accuracy. The rifle became a stepping stone in an ongoing race, one that would lead from black powder and flint to breech-loading carbines, from muskets to machine guns, from battlefields measured in yards to wars fought across continents. The cultural consequences were no less profound. The ideals of war shifted from valor in hand-to-hand struggle to the cool detachment of the marksman. The image of the warrior, once defined by his courage to close the distance, evolved into that of the rifleman, whose power lay in his ability to remain unseen. This shift in mindset mirrored larger changes sweeping across the continent: the rise of industrial thinking, the supremacy of technology over tradition, and the growing belief that progress was both inevitable and unstoppable. In that sense, the Kentucky rifle was more than a tool of war. It was a harbinger of a new era, one in which invention would dictate destiny, and where those who harnessed technology would shape the course of nations. Its impact was felt not only on battlefields, but in the balance of power between peoples, in the expansion of empires, and in the reordering of entire societies. The old ways of fighting, of living, of thinking about power could not survive its reach. And though the rifle itself would eventually be surpassed, the world it helped create endured. It left behind a continent transformed, its future written not by the swing of a tomahawk or the arc of an arrow, but by the straight, silent flight of a bullet that could find its mark far beyond the limits of sight.